What if the greatest horror was never God's wrath but his silence? Imagine a cathedral at midnight, its stained glass windows shattered, its candles guttering until the last flame dies in a curl of smoke. The pews are empty, the altar abandoned, the air heavy with the echo of prayers that will never be answered. The faithful kneel, waiting for a voice, a sign, a whisper from the heavens, yet only silence answers back. This is not the terror of punishment, but of abandonment. From the desolate landscapes of Berserk, where the idea of evil hides in shadows, to the fading flame of Dark Souls, where gods have retreated and left only a loop of despair. The nightmare is not invasion by demons, but vacancy of the divine. In SCP, when day breaks, the very sunlight that once symbolized salvation becomes an instrument of annihilation, as if the universe itself no longer knows the difference between blessing and curse. In Evangelion, crucifixes hang in laboratories, faith stripped of meaning, ritual performed by machines. In the mist, people gather in a supermarket to chant and sacrifice, trying to summon order in the absence of guidance. And in the road, a father and son walk across an ashen world, carrying a fire they cannot see because there is nothing else left. The horror of divine absence is not spectacle, but erosion. Laws without lawgiver, rituals without witness, prayers without response. It is a world still moving, but empty at its core, a machine with no operator. And the question that lingers is darker than any demon. What if God has already left, and we are the only ones still kneeling? The architecture of evil does not always reveal itself in the shriek of demons or the blaze of hellfire. Sometimes it is quieter, more suffocating, more terrifying. A world that continues to move after its divine core has already collapsed. This is the horror of abandonment, of a system that no longer has an author, yet still functions with mechanical precision, grinding down all who live within it. Evil here is not an active presence, but an empty throne, a silence that demands obedience because no one dares admit it is hollow. In Berserk, this absence is personified through the idea of evil, a godlike force buried in the abyss, unseen and silent. The world is not governed by a benevolent hand, but by a hidden entity born from collective despair. The God hand orchestrates horror, yet they are not creators, merely caretakers of a cycle humans themselves willed into existence. There is no salvation, no divine plan, only a system running on the inertia of suffering. The horror lies not in divine wrath, but in the revelation that God is indifferent, or worse, gone. In Dark Souls, the same architecture takes another form. The first flame flickers, the gods withdraw, and what remains is a cycle without end. Undead champions rise, fight, and rekindle the fire, only for it to fade again. The world lingers in twilight, locked in ritual repetition, a system that no longer serves a purpose but cannot be stopped. The gods who once guided men have disappeared into myth, leaving behind only fading embers and hollow rituals. Players are forced to ask, do you perpetuate the lie, or do you let the fire die and embrace the darkness? Both choices feel like obedience to a system already devoid of meaning. This architecture of evil thrives in emptiness. Where once there was divine presence, now there is only absence, yet the absence itself becomes prison. People cling to symbols and rituals even when their source has vanished. In the mist, the survivors trapped in a supermarket turn to ritualized fanaticism. A single voice misses. Carmody proclaims divine wrath, demands blood sacrifices, and the desperate follow. The system continues. Altar, offering obedience. But the God to whom they sacrifice is silent. It does not matter. The structure is enough. Fear feeds ritual. Ritual sustains order, and absence becomes indistinguishable from presence. Evangelion presents perhaps the most chilling variation. Here, symbols of faith crosses, scriptures, apocalyptic imagery are recoded into technological liturgy. The Instrumentality Project promises salvation by erasing individuality, merging all souls into one. It is a pact with absence disguised as transcendence. The divine is no longer a god but a machine, no longer love but efficiency. Ritual persists, test chambers like chapels, scientists as priests, crosses hanging over laboratories. The system wears the robes of faith, even as it hollows them out. The SCP Foundation tale When Day Breaks literalizes this architecture in a cosmic inversion. Light, once the purest symbol of safety, becomes lethal. The sun burns flesh into formless wax, twisting survivors into abominations. There is no God to explain, no salvation to suck only the cruel inertia of a universe where symbols no longer obey their meanings. The architecture of evil here is natural law itself gone mad, but still functioning with brutal regularity. The final image emerges in Cormac McCarthy's The Road. A man and his son walk through a barren wasteland. Number gods, no rituals, no institutions left. Yet even here, the architecture persists in its absence. The world still turns, the seasons still shift, but it is devoid of purpose. The father tells his son they are carrying the fire. The phrase is ritual mantra, repeated like liturgy, but the fire they invoke is unseen. Perhaps it is conscience, perhaps memory, perhaps nothing. What matters is that ritual persists even when the divine is gone. Because humans cannot survive without architecture, even hallowed. This is the true horror, that the system does not collapse when the gods depart. It calcifies, becomes mechanical, automatic, relentless. Laws without lawgiver, rituals without witness, prayers without response. The machine continues to grind, feeding on fear, obedience, inertia. The architecture of evil is not the presence of demonic power, but the absence of divine presence, concealed beneath endless repetition. And in this absence, humans themselves become the architects. It is our fear, our need for order, our unwillingness to face silence that sustains the machine. We sacrifice, we obey, we repeat, because to admit the throne is empty is unbearable. Better to imagine wrath than indifference. Better to fear punishment than to face silence. The architecture thrives on this refusal. It is built not of stone or scripture, but of the human terror of abandonment. So ask yourself, which is more terrifying, the presence of a cruel God or the absence of any God at all? Which is worse, damnation or silence? For silence demands nothing, yet takes everything. It is the system without center, the machine without master, the ritual without meaning. And that is the architecture of evil. Symbols are not static, they breathe, they evolve, they betray their makers. When the divine departs, the symbols remain like husks, drifting without anchor, terrifying precisely because they no longer point to anything beyond themselves. In the absence of God, the language of symbols mutates, becoming weapons of despair, mirrors of inversion, reminders of a covenant now void. Light is the most primal of these symbols. For millennia, light meant safety, the sun rising after a night of terrors, the candle glowing in darkened sanctuaries, the flame on the altar warding away chaos. In Scripture, God is light, salvation is illumination. Yet in SCP, when day breaks, this symbol is inverted with brutal precision. Sunlight liquefies flesh, turning humanity into wax-like abominations. The very essence of safety becomes instrument of annihilation. This is more terrifying than darkness, because it is betrayal. A symbol that once promised life now delivers death. The absence of God is not emptiness, but perversion. Signs continue to operate, but without meaning. The crucifix is another hallowed sign. Once it represented suffering transfigured into redemption, the paradox of death opening to eternal life. But in a godless architecture, it becomes decoration, background, ritual, repeated without presence. In Evangelion, crucifixes fall from the sky like missiles. Laboratories are lined with crosses, as if they were part of the machinery. The symbol is still there, glowing, commanding awe, but the divine meaning has drained out. The cross no longer points to salvation. It has become an empty sigil, a fossil of belief now wielded as tool of control. Flame too is corrupted. In Dark Souls, fire is both salvation and curse. The first flame gave rise to gods and men, but as it fades, rituals to rekindle it repeat endlessly. The chosen undead sacrifices themselves again and again, yet the flame never endures. Fire is no longer warmth or guidance, but cycle of futility. To kneel before the fire is to kneel before a lie. The symbol persists, the ritual repeats, but the divine source is gone. Light without God is just fire consuming itself. Even blood becomes a distorted symbol. In Berserk, the Eclipse transforms sacrifice into currency for the God Hand. Blood once symbolized life, covenant, connection. But in that hellish ritual, it is emptied of love and used only to purchase ascension for Griffith. The mark of sacrifice brands flesh as property of a system indifferent to human will. The symbol of covenant is corrupted into stamp of ownership. Consider the mist. Here, blood is demanded not by God, but by the fanatic leader, Mrs. Carmody. She insists blood offerings will appease wrath, yet no divine presence responds. Blood becomes spectacle, a sign performed to fill the silence. The symbol functions, but only horizontally, binding the community through fear. It points nowhere beyond itself. The road strips symbols bare, ash covers crucifixes, churches stand empty, fire burns only in memory. Yet the Father insists to his Son, we carry the fire. It is mantra, symbol, ritual phrase. But what fire? There is no visible flame, no proof. The fire is reduced to abstraction, conscience, dignity, hope. Here, the absence of God forces humans to redefine symbols on their own terms. They must believe in a fire they cannot see, or collapse into despair. This is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because the symbol no longer guarantees, liberating because it becomes human-made. This is the language of symbols and absence. Inversion, hollowing, parody, memory, light kills. Crosses decorate laboratories, flames burn without meaning, blood binds without covenant. Fire is carried though unseen. The horror is not that symbols vanish, they never do, but that they remain after God is gone, continuing their work without context. They are rituals without witness, gestures repeated into silence. Yet the persistence of symbols reveals another truth. They are not wholly dependent on divinity. They are rooted in human psyche. Even emptied, they still compel. People still bow before crosses, still light candles, still whisper prayers, even when certainty is gone. The architecture of evil exploits this. It does not need God to sustain power. It needs only the symbols and the human fear of emptiness. And yet within this distortion lies potential. If symbols can be inverted, they can also be reclaimed. To see sunlight as both life and death, to hold the cross as memory of suffering rather than empty ritual, to carry the fire consciously as act of will rather than guarantee these. Reinterpretations are forbidden precisely because they remove the system's monopoly. The absence of God does not erase symbols, it hands them back to us. So the question lingers. When you see a candle flicker, a crucifix hang, a flame sputter dew, you see divine presence or hollow sign. Do you recoil at the betrayal, or do you dare to reclaim it? The absence of God does not silence symbols, it forces us to speak their meanings anew. And in that moment, horror becomes possibility. Blood is the thread that runs through every myth of gods and demons, every sacrifice, every covenant. It is the fluid of life, yet also the mark of death. In the presence of divinity, blood was covenant Abraham's offering, Christ's crucifixion, the Eucharist's transfiguration. But when God withdraws, blood loses its transcendent anchor. It continues to flow, but now into silence, into rituals with no witness, into contracts with no one to honor them. In the absence of God, blood becomes the oldest currency still accepted, yet no longer redeemed. In Berserk, the most haunting moment is the Eclipse, when Griffith ascends by sacrificing his comrades to the God Hand. Here blood is not shed for love or covenant, but consumed as transaction. Every friend's body torn apart is payment for one man's dream of power. The brand of sacrifice sears onto survivors, marking them as livestock in a system beyond their consent. This blood flows not upward to God, but downward into a void, masquerading as divinity. It is covenant hollowed out into economy of despair. The mist offers another face of blood, trapped in the supermarket, terrified by incomprehensible creatures outside. The survivors seek meaning. Mrs. Carmody declares blood sacrifice the only answer. In desperation, the group obeys, casting out and killing their own. Blood spills, not to appease God, but to hold together a fragile ritual of control. It is spectacle, theater of fear. No divine presence responds. The creatures do not vanish. Yet the architecture of evil thrives in this absence. Humans themselves provide the harvest. The blood binds them, but only to each other's terror. In the road, blood is even more primal. The world is ash, the soil barren, the air heavy with death. Cannibals prowl, reducing survival to consumption of human flesh. Here blood is not symbol of covenant but meat, sustenance, grotesque parody of communion. Against this horror, the father insists to his son, "We carry the fire." Yet this mantra exists because blood dominates everything else. Either you shed blood to live or you are consumed. God is gone. What remains is the raw economy of survival. Blood flows, but it redeems nothing. Even in Dark Souls, blood flows invisibly. The player dies again and again, their essence souls harvested, spent, consumed. It is a metaphysical form of blood, currency that fuels both growth and endless death. The chosen undead rekindles the flame with sacrifice, but the sacrifice has no end. It is not covenant, it is taxation. You bleed to sustain a system already collapsing, fueling cycles that can never be resolved. The gods are absent, yet the bloodletting continues. Evangelion reveals the same logic in technological guise. The children who pilot the Evangelions bleed in mind and spirit. They are traumas harvested for a project promising transcendence. The blood is not always physicalized as psychological, emotional, existential. It is drained silently, ritualized through experiments, sanctified by crosses hanging in sterile labs. The absence of God is filled with machines, but the blood they demand is no less real. Humanity still pays, but the collector is faceless. This is the essence of blood as old as currency. It flows whether or not God is present. When God is gone, it no longer redeems, but still binds. It keeps the system alive, like fuel poured into an engine that no longer drives anywhere. Fear becomes blood, shame becomes blood, despair becomes blood. Every tremor of terror is offering, every silent prayer to an absent deity is tithe. Humanity continues to bleed because it cannot imagine not bleeding. The architecture depends on this inertia, but there is another layer. Blood also persists as memory. Even when divine absence hollows ritual, the sight of blood still evokes awe, terror, urgency. This is why rituals of sacrifice continue, even if no god remains to receive them. Humans are hardwired to see blood as sacred. The architecture of evil exploits this, siphoning life force into empty ceremonies. The Mist's mob believed killing a man might save them because blood feels like meaning. Griffith's sacrifice worked because blood binds even when God is gone. And yet, there is forbidden potential here. If blood flows anyway, if every day is sacrifice, what if the altar could change? What if instead of bleeding unconsciously into despair, blood could be consecrated into defiance? In the road, the Father's final sacrifice is not meaningless. His death is bloodshed for love, for continuity, for his son's survival. Though God is absent, the sacrifice still transmits fire. The blood nourishes hope, not ritual emptiness. The forbidden truth is this: blood cannot stop flowing. To live is to sacrifice through exhaustion, suffering, time, love. The question is, whose altar receives it? Do you bleed for the system, fueling rituals without witness, sustaining silence with despair? Or do you bleed consciously, offering life force to values chosen freely, to love, to sovereignty, to carrying the fire? The absence of God does not end sacrifice, it makes the choice starker. Blood remains the oldest currency. Even in silence, it is demanded, spilled, consumed. But in that silence, perhaps the only act of defiance is to choose its altar. The architecture wants you to believe all blood belongs to it. But what if the blood is yours? What if even in divine absence, the flow could become sacred again, not to God, but to the fragments of humanity that endure? If blood is the currency, then pacts are the contracts that record its flow. Every world haunted by the absence of God reveals itself as a marketplace of agreements, explicit or unspoken, that bind humans to forces they barely understand. With no divine presence to sanctify or annul them, these contracts become endless, looping, suffocating. They are written in silence, signed in despair, enforced not by gods, but by the inertia of systems that refuse to die. In Berserk, the most infamous contract is Griffith's, when he offers his comrades to the God Hand during the Eclipse. He signs a pact sealed not in ink, but in screams. His ascension to Femto is not gift, but transaction. Dreams of empire purchased with oceans of blood. The survivors are branded, marked as sacrificial livestock in perpetuity. This pact illustrates the horror of divine absence. No benevolent power intervenes, no higher justice corrects the imbalance. The contract stands because no god is left to contest it. Humanity is left alone with the ink of blood and the silence of the void. Dark Souls turns the entire universe into a contract without expiration. The chosen undead rekindles the fire again and again, binding themselves to a cycle that has no author, no end, no salvation. To accept the role of hero is to sign an agreement you never negotiated. Sacrifice your soul to prolong a fading world, or let it collapse into darkness. Both choices are contracts, neither leading to freedom. Here the pact is not explicit, is built into the system, woven into the fabric of reality. Consent is irrelevant. The contract enforces itself. In Evangelion, contracts are dressed in scientific robes. The human instrumentality project is presented as salvation, a collective pact to erase individuality and merge all souls into one. But beneath the promises lies horror, individuality, struggle, and choice sacrificed for an artificial unity. Children pilot Evangelions at the cost of their psyche, their trauma absorbed as payment. Every test, every battle, every silent nod of assent is a signature. No deity, witnesses, no covenant redeems. The pact is enforced by men, by institutions, by machines. It is binding precisely because God has left. And in his silence, human systems fill the void with endless contracts. The Mist offers a smaller, but no less terrifying example. The survivors trapped in the supermarket enter into an unspoken contract with Mrs. Carmody. Her words, laced with fanatic certainty, declare that blood sacrifice is necessary for survival. The terrified agree, not with pen and parchment, but with trembling obedience. The pact spreads, binding the group into ritual violence. Once again, no god sanctions this contract, no divine presence affirms it. It endures solely because humans, fearing the silence, would rather obey a false prophet than face the abyss. In the road, contracts take their most primal form. Without institutions, laws, or divine presence, only survival remains. The cannibals form pacts of mutual consumption. Today's victim ensures tomorrow's meal. Blood is contract, flesh is signature. The father and son resist, creating their own unspoken pact to carry the fire. To preserve humanity, even when the world demands betrayal. In absence, contracts multiply, not only those that enslave, but those that attempt to preserve dignity. Every step is a vow, every choice a covenant, even if no god remains to witness. The horror of these pacts lies in their permanence. Without God, there is no higher court to appeal to, no transcendent judge to annul the contract. Once signed, the pact endures sometimes for generations. Trauma itself becomes hereditary contract. The silence of a parent becomes the anxiety of a child. The sacrifice of ancestors becomes the fear of descendants. Families inherit covenants they never agreed to. Nations inherit rituals they never questioned. The system is sustained by these invisible contracts, passed along like cursed heirlooms. Modernity continues the same pattern. Every click of I agree on a glowing screen, every pledge of allegiance, every consumer debt is a contract. These are the new grimoires, written not in parchment but in code, binding millions into cycles of obedience. Like the rekindling flame, these contracts are endless subscription fees. Loans, terms and conditions that no one reads yet everyone signs. God's absence makes them absolute. They do not need justification. They endure because the system enforces them in silence. But the forbidden truth is this: contracts are not eternal. They persist only as long as belief sustains them. The architecture tells you otherwise, insisting that a pact with demons is irreversible, that baptism binds forever, that debt chains eternally. But all contracts written in blood, ink, or pixels depend on consent. Even unconscious consent is still consent. The moment you revoke it, the pact weakens. The architecture survives by convincing you that revocation is impossible. Awakening begins when you realize it is. Awakening means renegotiating, means tearing the contracts you never chose, declaring null the vows you never consented to, writing new covenants of your own, the road. The Father's pact with his Son to carry the fire is not binding because a God witnessed it, but because they chose it consciously. In absence, their contract is more sacred than any divine covenant. It is born not of fear, but of will. So the question becomes, whose contracts do you live by? The unspoken pacts of fear, the inherited agreements of silence, the cycles you never chose, or will you write your own, even if no God watches? The absence of God does not erase contracts, it multiplies them. The only way to survive is to choose which ones you sign. The most insidious trick of the system is not the shedding of blood or the writing of contracts, but the rewriting of morality itself. When God departs, his silence does not leave a vacuum, it leaves space for inversion. What was once holy becomes profane. What was once virtue becomes vice. What once guided becomes corrupted. The inverted moral code is how absence becomes presence, how silence becomes command. It is not that morality vanishes, but that it is twisted, until it feeds the machine of fear. Light has always been a symbol of salvation. God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all, Scripture declared. But in SCP, when day breaks, the sun, the ultimate symbol of divine benevolence, becomes an abattoir in the sky. Its rays liquefy flesh, twist humans into wax abominations, and erase individuality in melting terror. The inversion here is absolute. What once promised life now ensures death. Light becomes curse. Salvation becomes annihilation. Message is clear. Symbols will persist, but their moral meaning can be reversed until they terrify rather than redeem. Sacrifice is another symbol inverted. In the Christian imagination, blood sacrifice was the highest act of love. Christ's death transfigured into covenant. Suffering redeemed as salvation. But in Berserk, sacrifice at the Eclipse is act of betrayal. Griffith offers his comrades, not himself, to ascend. Love becomes selfish ambition. Covenant becomes exploitation. The survivors are branded, their suffering eternalized not as redemption, but as ownership. Sacrifice is hollowed into transaction, its morality reversed until horror masquerades as divine necessity. Faith, too, undergoes inversion. In the mist, the supermarket congregation prays and chants, clinging to rituals as monsters prowl outside. But their faith is not virtue, it curdles into fanaticism. Mrs. Carmody declares herself prophet, demands blood sacrifices, and the terrified obey. The moral code is inverted. Murder becomes obedience. Violence becomes holiness. Fear becomes faith. In absence of God, faith does not vanish, it metastasizes, mutating into obsession that enslaves rather than frees. Even perseverance becomes corrupted. In Dark Souls, the player's determination to continue, to fight, to rekindle the flame should be virtue. Yet the system twists it into futility. No matter how often you succeed, the flame dies, the cycle repeats. What should be courage is converted into endless obedience. You are lauded as hero, but shackled to meaningless loop. The moral code is inverted. Persistence is no longer noble, but proof of enslavement. Science itself can be inverted into morality's parody. Evangelion, laboratories are lined with crucifixes, apocalyptic scriptures mingled with data charts. The Human Instrumentality Project is justified as salvation of humanity, yet its cost is erasure of individuality. The moral code here teaches that loss of self is virtue, annihilation of uniqueness is transcendence. Science becomes religion, and religion becomes machine. Both stripped of meaning, both serving absence disguised as progress. The absence of God allows every moral axis to be flipped. Good becomes evil, evil becomes necessity, obedience becomes virtue, questioning becomes sin. Humanity, desperate for guidance, clings to these inverted codes because the alternative silence is unbearable. Better to accept perverted morality than to face emptiness. Better to believe light still saves, even as it melts flesh, than to admit salvation is gone. The inverted moral code also serves a deeper purpose. It ensures humans exile their own fragments. Innocence becomes corruption, so people distrust their purity. Wisdom becomes temptation, so they suppress their curiosity. A desire becomes sin, so they bury their vitality. Courage becomes futility, so they fear their own strength. In this way, the system harvests not only fear, but also energy, the raw blood of human potential bled into obedience. And yet, inversion is fragile. The moment you see it for what it is, the spell flickers. The moment you ask why light must always mean safety, why sacrifice must always mean love, why faith must always mean obedience, the architecture trembles. To recognize inversion is to reclaim fragments. To say light can kill, but also reveal. Sacrifice can enslave, but also liberate. Faith can enslave, but also inspire. The forbidden truth is that morality is not eternal law. It is stories. Stories can be inverted, but they can also be rewritten. Awakening begins when you hold paradox without collapse. When you can see light as both gift and curse, sacrifice as both love and exploitation, faith as both inspiration and fanaticism, you are no longer bound by inversion. You see the shadow and the fire together, refusing to exile either. This integration dissolves the architecture because its power lies in division. So the question is not whether morality exists in absence of God. The question is, whose morality? The one inverted by fear, or the one you dare to reclaim? Will you keep obeying the system that teaches you to fear your own fragments? Or will you invert the inversion and write a new code? For the horror of divine absence is not that morality is gone, but that it has been hijacked. The only path out is to reclaim it. Rituals do not vanish when God departs. They multiply. They linger like echoes in an empty cathedral, repeated by voices that no longer remember why they chant. In the absence of divinity, rituals become shells performed out of fear, inertia, or desperate hope. And this is where horror sharpens. Humans keep performing ceremonies even when no one listens, sustaining the architecture of evil with their own trembling hands. Look to the mist. The survivors huddle in the fluorescent-lit aisles of a supermarket, a setting stripped of sanctity. Yet soon, the atmosphere thickens with ritual. Mrs. Carmody preaches, her voice rising like liturgy. The crowd responds with amends, and eventually with blood sacrifices. An ordinary space transforms into cathedral of fanaticism. The ritual is not about divine presence. It is about binding the community together against the silence. They kill, not because God commands it, but because ritual demands it. The horror lies in its hollowness. In Dark Souls, the rekindling of the first flame is ritual par excellence. Chosen undead fights, suffers, dies, only to offer themselves to the fire. Each cycle repeats the same gestures: kneeling, burning, sacrifice. Yet the flame always fades, the ritual always resumes. This is not devotion, but futility, liturgy without audience. The gods are gone, yet the ceremonies grind on. The player themselves becomes priest of an altar with no deity, compelled to repeat a sacrament that redeems nothing. Evangelion distills this truth into technological theater. Laboratories are filled with crosses. Experiment chambers glow with sterile light. Scientists recite procedures with religious solemnity. Every launch of an Evangelion is a ritual. The child enters, systems synchronize, countdowns echo like psalms, alarms blare like organ music. The ritual looks scientific, but it feels ecclesiastical. In its end goal, the human instrumentality projects itself a grotesque ceremony of erasure. No god presides. Only machines and men, dressing control in liturgical robes. Even cosmic inversion creates rituals. In SCP, when day breaks, survivors scatter, creating routines of hiding from the sunlight, sealing windows, praying to a sun that only melts them. Their daily survival becomes ritual of avoidance, gestures repeated endlessly, with no hope of salvation. Each dawn becomes curse, each daybreak a sacrament of horror. The very act of cowering is transformed into ceremony, performed not before God, but before an indifferent cosmos. In the road, ritual becomes stripped to its bones. The father and son repeat daily routines, scavenging, guarding, whispering we carry the fire. Each gesture is right, each phrase mantra. No altar, no congregation, no divine witness, yet ritual persists because humans cannot live without it. To rise, to walk, to feed, to guard, to whisper hope, this is ceremony. Hollow perhaps, but necessary. It is ritual not to appease absent God, but to keep the soul intact in a godless wasteland. This persistence reveals the nature of ritual. It is not dependent on divinity. It is dependent on repetition. Humans enact ceremonies to create meaning even when no meaning exists. The architecture of evil thrives on this. By ensuring rituals continue even after God's silence, it harvests obedience without oversight. Exorcisms still expel, though no spirit departs. Mass still consecrates, though no grace descends. Horror films still terrify, though no demon waits behind the screen. Rituals everywhere sustained by inertia. Modernity proves the same. National anthems sung in stadiums, corporate logos glowing on billboards, hands raised in political rallies, is ritual. They summon unity, fear, obedience. They echo ancient ceremonies yet wear secular masks. Even scrolling through screens is ritual. Gestures repeated, attention consecrated, energy drained. In a world where God is absent, ritual is the true constant, binding humans into systems they mistake for freedom. But ritual is double-edged, enslaves when unconscious, but liberates when reclaimed. To light a candle in solitude, knowing no God watches, can still be sacred if the flame honors your own fragments. To whisper "we carry the fire with awareness" can turn hollow mantra into chosen vow. To trace a sigil not as curse but as mirror can transform ritual into awakening. The forbidden truth is that you cannot escape ritual. You are always in ceremony. The only question is whose script you perform. The horror of absence is that most rituals are written by systems, not by individuals. Humans kneel, chant, sacrifice not to God but to inertia. The architecture depends on this, because rituals channel energy regardless of meaning. As long as the gestures continue, the harvest flows. The supermarket congregation, the rekindled flame, the sterile laboratory, the whispered mantra sustain the machine. So what does awakening mean in such a world? Not to reject ritual, but to write it anew. To stop repeating ceremonies of fear and begin consecrating acts of sovereignty. To carry the fire not as command, but as choice. To bleed not into the void, but into creation. To whisper not to absent God, but to the fragments of yourself waiting in the shadows. Rituals are everywhere. They are in the chants of the fanatic, the sighs of the hopeless, the steps of the survivor, the clicks of the consumer. They cannot be escaped, but they can be reclaimed. And in that reclamation, silence becomes not horror, but possibility. Awakening in a world where God is left is not the sudden return of a voice from heaven. It is the recognition that the silence itself is the truth, and that you have been living inside a system built to mask that silence with endless rituals, contracts, and inversions. To awaken is not to hear God again, it is to realize you are the only voice left, and that voice matters. The first step of awakening is to see the machinery. In Dark Souls, you eventually recognize that the flame you keep rekindling will never last. You are trapped in an endless loop. The hero's crown a shackle disguised as glory. This realization is devastating, but it is also liberation. When you know the script is meaningless, you can choose whether to keep playing it. To awaken is to see the architecture for what it is, a cycle sustained by inertia, not divinity. The same happens in Berserk. Guts is branded, condemned to bleed forever, hunted by spirits he never summoned. He knows there is no God to annul his contract, no divine judge to free him, and yet he resists. His awakening is not escape from curse, but defiance within it. He embodies the forbidden truth, that resistance itself becomes sacred when no salvation remains. He carries his rage like fire, refusing to kneel. The road offers another version. The Father knows the world is dead, knows no prayer will bring back fertility to the earth, yet he tells his son they carry the fire. It is not literal, it is choice. The fire is dignity, conscience, human goodness, fragile but real. Awakening here is not waiting for God to return, is becoming the last bearer of meaning in a godless landscape. To awaken is to see that you were the ritual all along, the altar, the fire. In Evangelion, The awakening comes when Shinji rejects the instrumentality project. He refuses to dissolve into collective silence, even if individuality means pain. He chooses loneliness over false unity, imperfection over erasure. In doing so, he rewrites the script. The system demanded obedience. He claimed selfhood. In absence of God, the only salvation is to embrace one's fragment, one's shadow, one's fire. Awakening to the system is painful because it forces grief. You grieve the centuries of blood spilled into rituals no one witnessed. You grieve the generations bound by contracts signed in fear. You grieve the symbols inverted, the morality twisted, the fire carried in silence. But this grief is necessary. It clears the altar, it empties the chalice. It makes space for something new. Without grief, you remain chained to old ceremonies. With grief, you can burn them down. Then comes rebellion. Awakening is not passive, it is refusal. Refusal to keep chanting empty prayers. Refusal to keep rekindling fading flames. Refusal to keep sacrificing to silence. Rebellion does not mean destroying rituals, but reclaiming them. Light a candle not for absent God, but for yourself. Speak a mantra not to sustain the system, but to strengthen your fire. Rituals everywhere, but now they are yours. Integration is the final stage. Awakening is not about denying the shadow, but embracing it. The demons you feared were fragments exiled by inversion. The serpent is your wisdom. The dragon is your duality. The hungry ghost is your craving. Lilith is your sovereignty. Valak is your innocent power. Guts is your defiance. The father in the road is your conscience. To awaken is to welcome them back, to hold paradox without collapse. In doing so, you become what the system most fears, whole. And when you are whole, the architecture weakens, thrives only on your fragmentation, your obedience, your unconscious bleeding. Once you consecrate consciously your blood, your rituals, your contracts, the harvest ends. The machine grinds, but it no longer feeds. God may still be absent, but you have become presence. The silence remains, but now you are voice within it. The forbidden truth is this: you were waiting for God to return, but you were the one meant to stand in his absence. The fire you thought abandoned was inside you. The rituals you thought hollow can be rewritten. The contracts you thought eternal can be torn. The morality you thought inverted can be claimed anew. Awakening is not about finding God again, it is about becoming sovereign in his silence. So the question becomes, will you keep kneeling to rituals of fear, signing contracts of despair, bleeding into silence? Or will you rise, reclaim your fragments, and carry the fire as your own? Awakening is not escape. It is endurance, defiance, reclamation. It is realizing that in the absence of God, the sacred has not died, it has moved into you. The silence of God is not emptiness. It is the stage upon which you decide whether to kneel or to rise. Demons, rituals, contracts all were masks for your own shadow. The fire was yours all along. Comment your thoughts and subscribe. The descent into forbidden truths continues.